Chapter 3 discusses the fundamentals of the industry analysis. The industry analysis is used to explore the external environment of the firm. It is also relevant in both a corporate level and business strategy level. As mentioned in the textbook, corporate strategy focuses on which industries the firm should be engaged in and the allocation of its resources within that industry, while business strategy focuses on analyzing customers and their needs and preferences in order to establish a competitive advantage over its competitors. Corporate strategy decisions require assessment of attractiveness of different industries in terms of their profit potential, while business strategy decisions analyze the key success factors to assess how firms compete and serve their customers. Now, although this chapter focuses on the industrial analysis, we also have to look at the environmental analysis to get a full picture. The business environment of the firm consists of all external influences that impact its decisions and its performance, and those can be seen in Figure 3.1 below. Some of these environmental influences can be technology, government, political forces, social forces, demographics, and so on. All these environmental influences can be classified using the PEST analysis, which is short for political, economic, social, and technological factors. PEST analysis is useful to keep firms alert as to what is happening in the world and in its industry. However, the downside of this can potentially be with over scanning and analysis, there could be a large increase in costs to get relevant information. Effective environmental analysis is to distinguish what is vital from what is merely considered to be important. The industry environment is formed by its relationships with three key sets of players, which are known as the customers, suppliers, and competitors within the industry. As discussed in the last chapter, we learned that for a firm to make profit, it must create value for its customers. However, creating value does not necessarily always yield profit for the company. The value that is created is distributed between customers and producers by the forces of competition. In the chapter, it was discussed that the stronger the competition is among producers, the more value is received by the customers, which is known as consumer surplus. The definition of consumer surplus is the difference between the price the consumer is actually paying, and the maximum price that they would have been willing to pay for the product or service. The profits that are earned by a firm in an industry can be determined by three factors. The first is the value of the product to the customers, the second being the intensity of the competition within the industry, and the third is the bargaining power of the industry members relative to their suppliers and buyers. Industry analysis is used to bring all three of these factors into a single analytical framework. When analyzing industry attractiveness, one must look at how the industry structure drives competitive behavior. As mentioned in the textbook, there are some industries that consistently earn high rates of profit while others fail to even cover their cost of capital. Companies such as Altria, which is in the tobacco industry, and companies such as Procter & Gamble, which is in the household and personal products industry, have consistently seen a high rate of return on their equity, while companies such as United Continental and Delta Airlines, which belong to the airline industry, fail to see a return on their equity, or rather, see a negative return on their equity in that sense. Two reference points that were mentioned in the textbook regarding industry structure are the theory of monopoly and the theory of perfect competition. In a monopoly, a single firm is protected by high barriers of entry. In perfect competition, many firms supply a similar and homogeneous product, and there are very little to no entry barriers. Typically, under perfect competition, the rate of profit falls to a level that is just enough to cover the firm's cost of capital. The textbook also mentions that most manufacturing and service industries are known as oligopolies, which are industries that are dominated by a small number of major companies. Example of oligopoly would be the cell phone industry, where although there are smaller cell phone service providers, the major providers that dominate the industry are Verizon, Sprint, AT&T, and T-Mobile.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt, and I'm going to speak about the Porter 5 Forces of Competition Framework. The Porter 5 Forces of Competition Framework enables us to analyze the competition within an industry. This framework helps us assess the profitability of an industry by cross-analyzing its rate of return on capital against its cost of capital. To do this, the framework takes all components of an industry and their business relationships with one another into consideration. By doing this, projections of the economic impacts competition may have become possible. On the right is the basic framework of the Porter 5 Forces of Competition listed in the textbook. In this slide, I will begin discussing the components of the Porter 5 forces of competition. I will begin with the sources of horizontal competition, which are existing industrial competition or rivals, threat of new entrants, and competition substitution. The first section that I'll be talking about is the rivalry between established competitors. This level of competition is largely contingent on a particular industry. Competition can escalate by the factors listed in the framework. Increased competition can result in reduced or even negative profits for all companies involved. An example can be seen between Verizon and AT&T. As Pardeep had mentioned, these companies are established and compete for customers within the same marketplace. They are constantly competing to obtain the largest market share by offering services at lower prices. The companies are slightly differentiated, but not enough to prevent competition. The next is the threat of entry. Threat of entry is realized when an industry sees greater return on capital than cost of capital. This attracts others to enter and become competitors. An industry's risk of new entrants can be defined by the set of barriers that must be overcome in order to be established. As seen below, these barriers are capital investments, economy of scale, absolute cost advantages, product differentiation, distribution abilities, legal barriers, retaliation of other firms. The more of these factors that are present in an industry, the more difficult it is for new entrants to become established. In industries that require new entrants to pass many of these obstacles, the odds of success are relatively low, but the rewards will be high. This brings us to the threat of substitution. As the number of close substitutes to a product in a given area increase, the consumer demand becomes more elastic, respective of the price. As the number of suppliers increases, competition directly follows, driving the price down. Likewise, a lack of competitive suppliers of a product will reduce the consumer demand, causing the price elasticity to drop due to existing demand. In this slide, I will be discussing both the buyer and supplier components. The ability of buyers to drive down the price depends on their price sensitivity and bargaining power. Their price sensitivity is the total effect that a change in price will have on their operation. This is based on the proportional effect the purchased materials will have on the total cost of the product. If the industry is not differentiated, the buyer will be more price sensitive in order to compete efficiently. The ability to bargain stems from the concentration of buyers versus suppliers. The information you have on your competition and the suppliers, the cost of switching suppliers will have on your operation, and the backwards integration cost. Moving to suppliers, the key variable between suppliers and buyers is that the supplier is now the firm in the industry that are
Applying industry analysis to forecasting industry profitability. We have to understand how industry structure drives competition, which then determines industry profitability. Then you can apply this analysis to forecast industry profitability in the future. The first stage to doing so is to identify your main players. These are the producers, the customers, the input suppliers, and the producers of substitute goods. Then you examine their key structural characteristics, and that will determine competition and bargaining power. The textbook uses the example of the television industry, which comprises of production companies that produce content in the form of TV shows, network broadcasters and cable channels that commission the TV shows and create program schedules. Distributors are in the form of local TV stations, cable providers, satellite TV providers, and online video gaming companies. And the customers are the viewers and the advertisers. Forecasting industry profitability. We can use industry analysis to understand why profitability has been low in some industries and high in others. But current profitability is a poor indicator of future profitability. Changes in industry structure typically result from fundamental shifts in customer buying behavior, technology, and firm strategies. So to predict the future profitability of an industry, our analysis proceeds in 3 stages. First, you examine how the industry's current and recent levels of competition and profitability are the consequence of its present structure. Then you identify the trends that are changing the industry structure. And this could be new players seeking to enter the market, could be products are becoming more differentiated or more commoditized, as well as additions to the industry capacity, growth of demand. Lastly, technology can play a major factor into why the industry is changing. Lastly, you want to identify how these structural changes will affect the 5 forces of competition that Matt just described and result in profitability in that industry. Using industry analysis to develop strategy. We understand that industry structure drives competition. We learned that it determines profitability. Next step is to develop firm strategies. Strategies to alter industry structure. You must first identify the key structural features of an industry that are responsible for depressing profitability. Next, consider which of these structural features are amenable to change through appropriate strategic initiatives. Michael Gephardt states that industries are in the state of continued evolution and have the potential to influence development to suit their interests. He says the key is to identify bottlenecks. An example of architectural advantage done through bottlenecking is Apple creating its own bottleneck. They did so with the iTunes, which allows you to download music and you're unable to export the file. So this locks in the consumers, which is good for Apple. IKEA redefined roles and responsibilities in the industry by having customers purchase furniture and assembling it themselves. And this took away from IKEA having to pay for manufacturers to assemble the furniture. Next, the positioning the company. Through recognizing and understanding the competitive forces that a firm faces within its industry allows managers to position the firm where competitive forces are weakest. Through the emergence of Amazon and ebooks, traditional bookstores were starting to lose money. So what they did was some of them came up with cafes where they can generate revenue and create events where they would charge for admission. And that would be another way for them to generate revenue and reposition their company.
Economists define an industry as a group of firms that supplies a market, which means that there is a close correspondence between markets and industries. So what's the difference between industry structure and market structure? The difference is that industry analysis looks at industry profitability being determined by competition. Typically, industries are identified with relatively broad sectors, whereas markets relate to specific products. As mentioned in the textbook, the broad sector is the packaging industry, which compete in many distinct product markets, such as glass containers, steel cans, aluminum cans, paper cartons, and plastic containers. Another example is the banking industry. Institutions or banks supply a number of different products and services to different competitors. The most basic distinction is between retail banking, corporate and wholesale banking, and investment banking. Each of these can be separated into several different product markets. The central issue in defining industries and markets is to establish who is competing with whom. To do this, we need to recognize the principle of substitutability. There are 2 dimensions to this: substitutability on the demand side and on the supply side. The textbook example of substitutability on the demand side is if customers are willing to substitute only between Ferraris and other sports car brands on the basis of price differentials, then Ferrari is part of the performance car industry. If customers are willing to substitute Ferraris for other mass market brands, then Ferrari is part of the broader automobile industry. When talking about the supply side, if Ford and Hyundai are able to supply sports cars, then on the basis of supply side substitutability, we could regard Ferrari as part of the broader automobile industry. The key test of the geographical boundaries of a market is price. If customers are willing to substitute cars available on different national markets, or if manufacturers are able to divert their output among different countries to take account of differences in margins, then a market is global. If price differences for the same product between different locations tend to be eroded by demand side and supply side substitution, then the locations lie within a single market. Key success factors are factors within an industry that influence a firm's ability to outperform rivals. To survive and prosper in an industry, a firm must meet two criteria. First, it must supply what customers want to buy, and second, it must survive competition. We need to know who our customers are, what their needs are, and how they choose between competing offerings. Once we recognize the basis upon which customers choose between rival offerings, we can identify the factors that make the firm successful. The second question requires that we examine the nature of competition in the industry. We must recognize how intense the competition is and their key dimensions. For example, when analyzing the supermarket industry, customers want low prices, convenient location, wide product range, fresh quality produce, ease of parking, and pleasant ambiance. Secondly, intense competition depends upon the number and proximity of competitors. The key factors in the supermarket industry are large-scale purchases, low wages, differentiation to allow a wide product range, convenient location, and familiarity with local customer preferences. The last slide of this presentation explains the profitability formula used in the textbook to identify the key success factors in the airline industry. Profitability, as measured by operating income per available seat mile, or ASM, is determined by three factors. Yield, which is the total operating revenues divided by the number of revenue passenger miles, or RPMs. Load factor, which is the ratio of RPMs to ASMs. And unit cost, which is the total operating expenses divided by ASMs. Revenue and RPM's main determinants are intensity of competition, ability to attract customer, and superior customer service. Load factors, which are RPMs divided by ASM's main determinants are competitiveness of prices, building customer loyalty through quality of service and frequent flyer programs, and efficiency of route planning. The main determinants of expenses in ASMs are wage rates and benefit levels, fuel efficiency of aircraft, administration costs, and productivity of employees. To enhance revenue, several airlines have withdrawn from their most intensely competitive routes, while others have cut costs by increasing employee productivity, reducing overheads, sharing services with other airlines, and reducing salaries and benefits. In conclusion, the value of Porter Framework is a practical tool in helping us to understand the disparities in profitability between industries, whether an industry will sustain its profitability into the future, and which startup companies have the best potential for making money.